Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Spirit of Le Mans on Gran Turismo Sport. And of course, this is not a conventional Le Mans prototype, it's a concept, a Vision GT car, so some people might be wondering why is it categorised in Spirit of Le Mans rather than Visions of Tomorrow, which is my review series for the Vision GT cars. The reasoning is fairly simple, and that is that with certain vehicles, at least as far as I'm concerned, you can kind of file them under more than one category. For instance, something like a Honda CRX. It's technically a hatchback, and it's also technically a sports coupe. Which one would you think of it as first? Would you put it in there with stuff like a Renault Clio? Or would you put it in there with stuff like a Lotus Europa? Probably more so the Lotus Europa, because although the Europa isn't a hatchback, it's closer to being that kind of car. Because although it is a hatch, the CRX that is, it's more so a small sports coupe and a hatchback second to that. Likewise with the LM55, for me at least, and after all it's me who's categorising the cars on the channel, I don't feel that the LM55 is a Vision GT car first and foremost. The fact that it is a Vision GT car is incidental, because this car's primary purpose is to be a modern interpretation of the 787B. That's the whole purpose of the car. Then the fact that it's a VGT concept is secondary to that, because Mazda could have made anything into a Vision GT car, but they chose this as a direct homage to their most famous race car. So, as such, I feature it first and foremost in this category. So, with that blurb out of the way, why are we featuring it again? Because, of course, we have already discussed the LM55. And I gave it some of the highest scores of the old school way of doing Spirit of Le Mans. Well, that hasn't really changed. This car is still very good, and even in the Gr.1 class, which is this version, not the Group X, it still has stuff like all-wheel drive to help it out. And a lot of people don't like the LM55 because of that all-wheel drive. People who would call themselves purists and professionals and consider themselves to be more skilled than other people. Maybe you're faster, maybe you're not. Who really cares? People think that all-wheel drive is a beginner-friendly tool that professionals shouldn't use. A bit like traction control. Well, sorry to break it to you guys, but all GT class race cars have traction control. So perhaps you'd like to go and talk to them and tell them how it's for beginners, while you're playing your little racing game in your mum's basement. So the fact that this car has all-wheel drive is not OP. It's not for beginners, it's a tactical advantage, and it's one to be used. However, it's not totally OP, because all-wheel drive itself has disadvantages. And one of them is that sometimes you can have too much grip, and of course that depends on tyres as well, but in low speed corners in particular you can definitely feel that this car has all-wheel drive, and it's not always as fast as even something like a front-wheel drive Nissan Nismo LMP machine, which can turn in much better. This car has heavier steering even when you're not applying throttle, so it does have a measure of disadvantage to keep it in check. The main reason why I would recommend the LM55 hasn't really changed though, and that is the simple tactical advantage that all-wheel drive can give you. Not just as a beginner, because it is definitely a brilliant beginner's car. I would say probably so far, at least off the top of my head, this is probably the go-to Group 1 car that I would recommend for beginners, less experienced drivers, because it is forgiving. I'm not denying that. However, another advantage of all-wheel drive is that it's great for endurance. And I don't mean how long the tyres last, I mean when you're driving a car lap after lap, hour after hour, you need to have a car that you can to some degree turn your brain off and autopilot. Especially when you're in the lead and you don't need to be pushing the car as hard as physically possible, because if you do that lap after lap, every lap that you push the car, the percentage of making a mistake gets higher. That's the simple way that physics and the laws of odds work. So, having a car that does help you out a bit with all-wheel drive can actually help you to maintain a better average pace over an endurance race. So that even if you're not a beginner is a huge advantage of something like an LM55, because the car does help you to relax a bit more. The payoff to that, to stop it from being a completely OP vehicle, is that it's categorically not as fast as some of the other prototypes through corners. It saves you more, but that doesn't make it quicker. much in the same way as the front-wheel drive of the Nissan Nismo actually makes it much more beginner-friendly in terms of losing control, because the car will right itself, for instance, if you catch a tyre on the grass. However, it's not as quick as a rear-wheel drive car through a tight corner, for that same reason. So it has an advantage, but it's paid off with a disadvantage, and that's what keeps things fair. Another thing that keeps things fair with the LM55 is the fact that it has far less power and more weight in the Group 1 class than it did on Gran Turismo 6. 641 horsepower, 417 pound-feet of torque, and it weighs a little bit more at 880 kilos. Now, to put that into perspective, on Gran Turismo 6 it had roughly 830 horsepower and weighed 830 kilos, which is incidentally the same weight as a Mazda 787B, which, as we said, this car is the modern equivalent of. So, what kind of difference has that made? Because the LM55 on Gran Turismo 6 had incredible straight-line performance, but not so much for acceleration. In fact, most of the other prototypes could outrun it, especially for mid-range acceleration. But for top-end speed, there were very few that could come close if you tuned it correctly, because it could do around 290 miles per hour. Incredibly quick machine, especially given that it has no way near the power of really any of the other prototypes apart from the Zytec LMP2 car. So what about now? Well, it's actually done a really good job of keeping its performance, because even with full downforce, once you convert it from the standard 8-speed gearbox to the customizable 7-speed, you can still quite easily get over 230 out of it, as you can see here. That's mile per hour, of course. So it hasn't really sacrificed that much top-end speed. The bigger difference with an LM55 in losing power is, funnily enough, very similar to the kind of difference that it makes when you power restrict an electric car on Gran Turismo. The top speed doesn't really change, it just takes longer to get there. And that's the kind of difference that the LM55 has, because although it's fast, for sure, most of its speed comes from how forgiving it is through corners. In a straight line, the acceleration is not as good as you might think. Something like an R18, especially a Nissan Nismo, they can absolutely blow this thing into the weeds easily. So it's not an OP vehicle in that way. In fact, the way that it could be considered OP is a relatively narrow one. It's just more forgiving. That's it. And so overall, I would say that the LM55 is a perfect car for people who are inexperienced with Gran Turismo as a whole, but more specifically, don't have a huge amount of experience with Le Mans prototypes, because it can allow you to run with the pack until you have enough skill to drive something with a more conventional layout, which will end up being quicker than this. So overall, that's it for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.